The world, once a vibrant and noisy tapestry of suburban bliss, had shrunk to the four beige walls of this hospital room. The only sound was the low, fluorescent hum from the ceiling lights, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my teeth. For me, David Miller, a man who built a successful architecture firm by imposing order on chaos, this absolute powerlessness was a new and terrifying poison, seeping into the foundations of my life. My world wasn't blueprints and steel beams anymore. It was my wife Jessica and our 7-year-old son, Ethan. Just last week, our biggest debate was whether Ethan was old enough for a 2-week sleepaway camp. Now we were in a silent, desperate negotiation with fate itself. Ethan, our bright, fiercely energetic boy whose laugh could fill our entire house, was tired. It wasn't the happy exhaustion of a long day of school and soccer practice. It was a deep cellular fatigue that had stolen the rosy light from his cheeks and given his skin an almost translucent quality. The bruises, which we'd first dismissed as the typical proud marks of a rambunctious boy, had become a constellation of ugly purple and lavender shadows on his pale skin. The hospital smelled of bleach, rubbing alcohol, and a third, fainter scent of quiet dread. Dr. Chen, a man with kind, weary eyes that had clearly delivered too much bad news, had given us the verdict an hour ago. Aplastic anemia, a rare, vicious disease where Ethan's own body had turned on its bone marrow, effectively shutting down the factory that produced new blood cells. The words hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating as smoke. "His best chance," Dr. Chen had explained, his voice a low, steady drone against the frantic, panicked drumming in my ears, "is a bone marrow transplant. The very first step, the one we always take, is to test the immediate family. We'll need to take samples from you and Jessica today to see if either of you is a viable match." "Of course," I said immediately, my voice a strained imitation of my usual confidence. "Whatever it takes, we'll do it." Jessica, sitting beside me, nodded in jerky agreement, but when her hand found mine, it was as cold and clammy as stone. Her beautiful face, the one I'd fallen in love with a decade ago at a friend's chaotic backyard barbecue, was a mask of strained composure. Then, as the nurse bustled in with the testing kits, a look of profound, gut-wrenching terror flashed in Jessica's eyes. It was a look that went far beyond a mother's natural fear. It was sharper, more specific, a targeted panic. "David," she whispered, her voice tight and thin as she watched the nurse unseal the sterile swabs. What if one of us is a match? I've heard it's a major procedure. It's so risky for the donor." I frowned, completely bewildered by her premature, misplaced anxiety. "Let's cross that bridge when we come to it, honey," I said, trying to soothe her. "Right now, we just have to hope for a match. For Ethan." But as the nurse gently took her cheek swab, Jessica couldn't look at me. She stared at a single, scuffed point on the far wall, her jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles twitching. Her fear wasn't about the disease anymore. I could feel it. Her fear was about the test itself. It was the first deep, jarring crack in the foundation of my world, a hairline fracture that made no logical sense at all. The 3 days we spent waiting for the results were a slow descent into a private, domestic hell. The oppressive silence in our home, usually filled with Ethan's shouts and the sound of cartoons, was broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. My own anxiety was a constant, dull ache behind my ribs, a passenger I carried everywhere. But Jessica's had transformed into something sharp, frantic, and unnervingly active. She wasn't just worried. She seemed to be actively campaigning against a reality that hadn't even happened yet, building a fortress of fear around a hypothetical scenario. "I was reading online," she said one evening, her back to me as she went through the motions of chopping carrots for a dinner neither of us would have the stomach to eat. The rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the knife on the cutting board was the only sound. "The risks for bone marrow donors are far more serious than they let on. Chronic pain, nerve damage. I found a forum where a woman said her husband has never been the same. People have even died, David." "Jessica, please," I pleaded, the frustration simmering beneath my own grief. "We don't even know if I'm a match, or if you are. Let's not borrow trouble from a future that might not exist." But she wouldn't let it go. It was a constant, relentless barrage of what-ifs, and they were all aimed squarely at me, like a preemptive strike. "If you turn out to be the match," she insisted the next day, her tone gaining a sharp, almost accusatory edge, "I really think we need to seriously consider waiting for another donor on the National Registry. Ethan needs his father to be strong and healthy for the rest of his life. It would be selfish of you to take that kind of risk." The word selfish struck me like a physical slap. "Selfish?" I asked, my voice rising in disbelief. "To save my son's life? How in God's name is that selfish? You're not thinking about the long-term consequences," she shot back, her voice climbing with a hysterical edge that bordered on panic. "You're just thinking about being the hero right now. What if it disables you? Who takes care of this family then? Who takes care of me?" Her logic was a twisted, broken thing, a funhouse mirror reflection of a loving wife's concern. It felt rehearsed. A cold, hard knot of suspicion began to form in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't about my health. She was terrified of the genetic information these tests would reveal. This desperate, irrational campaign of dissuasion wasn't about protecting me. It was about stopping something, hiding something, and her mounting desperation was becoming as frightening as our son's diagnosis. I was at my office, trying to lose myself in the familiar comfort of work, but the crisp lines of a high-rise blueprint on my screen were just a meaningless blur. The world outside my window felt distant, a pantomime of normal life that I was no longer part of. Then my phone, sitting silent on the desk, lit up and began to vibrate. The hospital's main number flashed on the screen, and my heart instantly seized, a painful clench in my chest. I snatched it up, my throat so dry my voice came out as a ragged croak. "Hello? This is David Miller." "Mr. Miller?" It was Dr. Wallace, the head of pediatric oncology, a senior physician with a reputation for being brilliant and blunt. His voice was not the kind bearer of good news, nor the gentle deliverer of bad. It was somber, clinical, and freighted with a seriousness that immediately set off every alarm bell in my body. "David, the preliminary results from your family's HLA typing are in and have been reviewed." I held my breath, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. "And?" I managed to ask. "Are we a match? Is one of us a match?" There was a significant pause on the other end of the line, a chasm of silence that stretched my nerves to their absolute breaking point. In that quiet, I imagined a dozen different horrible scenarios for Ethan. "It's not that simple," Dr. Wallace said finally, his tone heavy and deliberate. "There is a significant and highly unusual anomaly in the test results, something I have never personally encountered in my 30 years of practice." My mind immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion for my son. An anomaly? What does that mean for Ethan? Is his condition more complicated than you thought? Is the cancer worse? "No, Ethan's diagnosis and condition are unchanged," he said, his calm voice cutting through my panicked spiral. "The anomaly doesn't concern his illness directly. It concerns his genetics and yours." The word hung there, ominous and undefined, a storm cloud on the horizon. "I don't understand." "I know. And frankly, this is not a conversation I can have with you properly over the telephone," Dr. Wallace said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more confidential. "I need you to come to the hospital, to my office, as soon as you are able." Then he added the 6 words that turned the blood in my veins to ice. "And David, please come by yourself." The request was a thunderclap in the quiet of my office. This wasn't a family consultation. This wasn't a medical update for a concerned couple. This was a summons. He was deliberately separating me from my wife to deliver this news. In that single, terrifying moment, I knew with an unshakable certainty that the problem wasn't just in Ethan's blood. It was in my life, my marriage, my entire reality. I was driving toward a reckoning, and I had no idea what I had done to deserve it. Dr. Wallace's office was a fortress of mahogany and leather-bound medical texts, a stark, quiet contrast to the sterile chaos of the hospital halls. It felt like a confessional, with his large desk serving as the altar. He gestured for me to sit in the heavy leather chair opposite him, a chair that felt like it had absorbed the weight of 1,000 sorrows. He didn't waste time with small talk. He got straight to the point, and his first words were a clean, precise blow that shattered my world. "David," he said, his eyes meeting mine with a look of profound professional seriousness that offered no comfort. "I'm going to be direct. Based on a full genetic comparison, which is a standard part of this transplant workup, we have determined with 100% scientific certainty that you are not Ethan's biological father." The words hit me like a physical impact, knocking the air from my lungs. A hot, dizzying shame washed over me, so intense it made the room swim. Jessica. My mind screamed her name, the lies, the secrets, the past 8 years of what I thought was a happy marriage. All of it curdled into a bitter poison in my gut. Her frantic, bizarre behavior of the last few days suddenly made a horrible, twisted kind of sense. She was terrified of this test because she knew it would expose a long-buried affair. She had been protecting herself, not me. "I see," I managed to choke out, the words tasting like ash. My world, so carefully constructed, had just collapsed into a pile of rubble. I was still reeling from this ultimate betrayal, my mind a maelstrom of anger and grief, when Dr. Wallace held up a hand, his expression somehow growing even more grave. "David, please, let me finish. That's the first anomaly, but it's not the most significant one." I looked at him, my mind unable to process what could possibly be worse than this. My life was already a lie. "The truly confounding part," he continued, leaning forward on his desk, his voice low and intense. "The biological impossibility that forced us to investigate further is that Jessica isn't his mother either." The room tilted violently. The words didn't compute. It was like he just calmly stated that the sky was green and the earth was flat. "What? That's impossible," I stammered, my brain refusing to accept the input. "I was there. I was in the delivery room. I cut the umbilical cord. I saw her give birth to him with my own 2 eyes." "We know," Dr. Wallace said, his voice softening with a trace of pity. "That's what made us dig deeper. That's what made this an institutional emergency. We pulled the original birth records from St. Jude's Hospital. There were 2 baby boys born within an hour of each other that night. Both had minor complications, jaundice, and were taken to the NICU for observation under the blue lights." He paused, letting the monstrous implications sink into my shattered consciousness. "We believe a catastrophic human error was made. A tired, overworked nurse, a chaotic moment. The ankle bracelets were switched." I stared at him, my mind struggling to connect the 2 explosive truths. Not an affair. Not a simple, sordid betrayal. Something infinitely more complex and horrifying. A stolen child. 2 stolen children. And Jessica. Her panic, her lies, her desperate attempts to stop the test. It wasn't to hide infidelity. It was to hide this impossible, life-destroying secret she had been carrying alone. The drive home was a disorienting nightmare. The familiar streets of my neighborhood looked alien, the houses like cardboard cutouts in a life that no longer belonged to me. I was a ghost in my own skin, operating on pure, unadulterated shock. My grief and rage over a presumed affair had been vaporized and replaced by a dizzying, untethered horror. I walked into the house, and the silence of it pressed in on me. Jessica was in the living room, pacing a worn path into the carpet, her face pale and etched with a terrible anxiety. The moment she saw my expression, the dead, hollow look in my eyes, she knew. Her hand flew to her mouth, a gesture of pure dread. "What did they say?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "David, what did the doctor say?" "He said it's a miracle Ethan is as healthy as he is," I began, my voice flat, cold, and devoid of any emotion, "considering he has no genetic relation to either of the people who have been raising him." The carefully constructed mask on her face didn't just crack, it crumbled into dust. A sob, thick and guttural, tore from her throat, a sound of such profound agony it seemed to come from the very center of the earth. It was the sound of a 7-year secret finally being dragged, kicking and screaming, into the light. She collapsed onto the sofa, her body shaking with violent, heaving cries that seemed to have no end. I stood over her, a cold, remote judge. "When did you know?" I asked, the question hanging in the dead air between us. When did you find out he wasn't ours? About 4 years ago, she stammered through the racking sobs. He needed a routine blood test for a school physical. His blood type, it was O negative, and you and I were both A positive. The doctor, our GP, he said it was a biological impossibility. He just assumed the lab had made a mistake and told us to retest, but we never did. But I knew. In that moment, I knew. I went online. I researched it for weeks. I never told you. I was so scared. Scared? I roared, the rage finally breaking free from the ice of my shock, hot and volcanic. You were scared? So you decided to keep living this monumental lie? You let me believe this boy was my flesh and blood when you knew he wasn't? He is our son! She shrieked, her grief turning to a desperate, wild defense, her eyes flashing with a mad terror. I'm the only mother he's ever known. I love him more than my own life. I was terrified they would take him away from us. I was terrified you would leave me if you knew. So you were willing to let him die? I shot back, the accusation a venomous dart that found its mark. This transplant, this test, you fought it tooth and nail. You were willing to risk his actual life, to let him wither away and die just to protect your precious, selfish secret? The truth of it hung in the room, ugly and undeniable, poisoning every memory we had ever made in that house. Her fear had made her a monster. Her love, twisted and suffocated by her secret, had become a cage for all of us. I love him, she whispered again, a pathetic, broken mantra. He is not yours, I said, the words as cold and hard as granite, and he is not mine, but I'm going to save him, and you and I are finished. In the ruins of our living room, our marriage dissolved, a casualty of a lie born in a hospital nursery 7 years ago. In the days that followed, a strange cold clarity settled over me. It was the clarity of a man who has lost everything and has only one task left. The grief was immense, a vast empty chasm where my life used to be. But floating above that chasm was a singular, unwavering purpose, a lighthouse in the storm. Save Ethan. Everything else was just noise. I moved out of the house we had shared and into a sterile corporate apartment, a beige box with no memories to haunt me. I lived on black coffee and sheer force of will. My lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Miss Cole, who looked like she ate legal jargon for breakfast, handled all communication with Jessica. The divorce was filed. The betrayal of the lie, even if not born of infidelity, was too absolute, too monstrous for any other path. There was no going back. Ethan was my son. That was the one truth that remained. The bond forged over 7 years of bedtime stories, of patching up scraped knees, of whispering secrets in the dark, could not be broken by a lab report. But he needed a donor, and his supposed parents were not an option. The search on the National Bone Marrow Registry began, a frantic, desperate race against the clock, a lottery of life where my son's future was the jackpot. Simultaneously, the hospital, facing a lawsuit of unimaginable proportions and a public relations nightmare, launched its own internal investigation with terrifying efficiency. They had the records from St. Jude's. They knew the name of the other family, the Wrights, Michael and Laura Wright. They lived just 2 towns over, completely oblivious, raising a little boy named Jacob, my biological son. The thought sent a jolt through my system every time it surfaced, a strange, painful mix of intense longing and absolute terror. Did he have my smile, my terrible singing voice, my love for drawing? The need to know him, to see him, was a physical hunger. Miss Cole began the delicate, impossibly complex legal process of approaching them. My life now had 2 frantic, parallel missions, each one a Herculean task. Find a complete stranger in a national database to save the son I had raised from the day he was born, and prepare to meet the stranger who was my own flesh and blood. The weight of it was crushing, but for the first time since the diagnosis, my path, while terrifying, was brutally clear. I had to save one boy and find another. It was the heavy, solemn purpose of a father. 2 weeks later, 2 phone calls, hours apart, changed the entire trajectory of my shattered life. The first was from Dr. Wallace. His voice, for the very first time since I had met him, was audibly light, almost joyful. "David, we found one," he said, and I could hear the smile in his words. "A preliminary match on the registry, a young man in California, a college student. It's a 10 out of 10 match. It's as perfect as it gets. We have a donor for Ethan." The relief that washed over me was so powerful, so absolute, it felt like a physical force. My knees buckled. I sank into the cheap desk chair in my sterile apartment, dropping the phone onto the desk, and buried my face in my hands. Tears I hadn't even known I was holding back streamed through my fingers. Hot tears of pure, unadulterated gratitude. Ethan had a chance. A real chance, untethered from the lies and secrets that had almost cost him his life. He was going to be okay. The second call, that evening, was from Miss Cole. Her tone was measured, professional, and somber. "They know," she said quietly. "The hospital's legal team and a grief counselor met with the Wrights this afternoon. They've done the genetic testing on their end. It's confirmed. David, they want to meet you." The news landed with a different kind of weight. The immediate life-or-death crisis for Ethan was averted, but now a new one, a crisis of the heart and soul, was just beginning. I was about to meet the parents who had raised my biological son, and they were about to meet the father of the boy they had called their own for 7 years. Miss Cole arranged the meeting for the following week, in a neutral space. I spent the next few days in a daze of anticipation and dread. I rehearsed what I would say, what I would ask, but it was all useless. I was about to step through a door and into a life I never knew existed, to meet a child who was a stranger, but who was also an undeniable part of me. The meeting was held in a neutral, soulless conference room at Miss Cole's law firm, a space designed for conflict resolution and devoid of any warmth. I sat on one side of a long polished table, my hands trembling slightly under the surface. The door opened and they walked in, Michael and Laura Wright. They looked exactly how I felt, shell-shocked, heartbroken, their eyes red-rimmed and hollowed out by sleepless nights and unshed tears. And between them, holding his mother's hand so tightly his knuckles were white, was a little boy with dark curly hair, a serious expression, and my eyes, the shape of my own jaw, the same unruly cowlick I fought every morning. It was like looking at a ghost of myself, a photograph from a life I had never lived. My breath caught in my throat. This was Jacob, my biological son. He looked at me with a child's simple, unvarnished curiosity, completely unaware of the earthquake shaking the foundations of his world. There were no accusations, no anger. How could there be? We were all victims, 4 parents adrift in the same impossible, tragic sea. Laura Wright was the first to speak, her voice trembling as she looked at me, her eyes filled with a mother's pain. "Ethan," she whispered, testing the name of her biological child, a name she had only just learned. "The lawyer said they found a donor. Will he be okay?" The question, so full of genuine, selfless concern for the boy she had never met, broke the unbearable tension. "He's strong," I said, my own voice thick with emotion. "The transplant is scheduled for next week. The doctors are very, very optimistic." We talked for over an hour, a sacred, painful exchange of stolen memories. We shared photos on our phones, bridging the 7-year gap with digital images. I showed them pictures of Ethan learning to ride his bike, his face a mask of fierce concentration. They showed me videos of Jacob at his first t-ball game, swinging the bat with a clumsy determination that made my heart ache. We were mapping out the lives of our stolen children, trying to piece together 2 broken, overlapping histories. It was surreal, heartbreaking, and in a strange, fragile way, beautiful. We agreed to move forward slowly, cautiously, for the boys' sakes. Therapists would be involved. We would build a bridge between our 2 shattered worlds. As the meeting ended, Michael Wright, the man who had tucked my son into bed every night for 7 years, put a hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, a gesture of solidarity. "We'll get through this," he said, his voice raw but steady. "Together. For them." I could only nod, unable to speak past the massive lump in my throat. Later that day, I was back at the hospital, sitting in the vinyl chair by Ethan's bed. He was awake, and we were playing a tense game of Go Fish. He looked up at me and smiled, a weak but genuine smile that lit up his pale face. "I love you, Dad," he said, before laying down a winning pair with a triumphant flourish. In that moment, all the noise, the lawyers, the betrayal, the genetics, the chaos, faded away to nothing. Biology didn't matter. Love did. "I love you too, son," I replied, my heart aching with a fierce, protective love that was bigger than blood or betrayal. I had 2 sons now. One was getting a second chance at life in this hospital bed, and the other was sleeping in a house 2 towns over, a stranger who shared my face. My path forward was no longer a straight, simple line. It was a tangled, difficult road connecting 2 families, paved with sorrow and uncertainty. But for the first time since the world had fallen apart, it was a road filled not with despair, but with a profound, terrifying, and unwavering hope.